Today's daf is daf Chaf Zayin, and we had various issues about using an idol worshiper as your doctor, as a physician, or as a moel. And in a paradoxical sense, it turns out that according to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, it's okay to use a kusi as a moel. And the Gemara asks the following question: V'atanya, we have a brisa that says that Yisrael Molas Hakusi, a Jew is allowed to do Mila for a Kusi. We'll have to see what the Chiddush of that is. The Kusi lo Yomel Yisrael. However, we cannot allow a Kusi to serve as a Moel, to circumcise a Jewish child, Mipnei Shemol Shem Har Grizim, because his Mila is not for the purpose of Mila. He's not doing it L'Shem Mila, but rather he's doing it for the purpose of Hargrizim. That's where they had their idol. It was in the shape of a great dove. So there's halacha in Mila that the Mila has to be done l'shem Mila, for the purpose of Mila. He's not doing it for the purpose of the mitzvah of Mila. He's doing it for the purpose of Hargrizim. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda now is contradicting himself, because we actually clarified Rabbi Yehuda as being more liberal and allowing a kusi to do a mila. Oma lo Rabbi Yossi v'chi heichan metzilim mila minatol l'shma. Your underlying premise, Rabbi Yehuda, is that you need lishma. You have to do the circumcision not for health purposes, and certainly not for hargrizim, but rather for the sake of the mitzvah of mila. How do you know that? Ella, but rather Rabbi Yossi, who attacks Rabbi Yehuda, says that Molva Holechad Shetetzi Nishmasa, that a kusi can continue to do Mila. So anyway, what do we do with this contradiction of Rabbi Yehuda? Eliolam Epuch Kirapchina Meikara. So the Gemara goes back to the assumption that it's Rabbi Yehuda who prefers to have an idol worship do the Mila rather than a kusi, whereas Rabbi Meir would allow a kusi. So now it comes out that Rabbi Yehuda would not allow a kusi, and that's against this brisa. Uda kokasha de Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda say, how do we reconcile these two rulings of Rabbi Yehuda? Whereas in one brisa, Rabbi Yehuda draws the conclusion that an idol worship is possible for Mila. Hahid Rabbi Yehuda nasihi. That's not the same Rabbi Yehuda. They're two different Rabbi Yehudas. Rabbi Yehuda nasi omer minayin lemila beovid kocham shi psula. And now we're holding that Rabbi Yehuda is going to derive from a pasuk that the mila of an ovid kocham is pasul. Tamalon vi'ata es brisi tishma. Vi'ata refers to a Jew. So a Jew could fulfill the covenant, the mila, but not an akum. Fine. So now, Omar of Chizda, my time with Rabbi Yehuda, what was the reasoning for Rabbi Yehuda that you need Mila Lishma? Dichsiv La Himol. Now, this is very strange. The pasuk doesn't really say La Himol. I mean, it depends how you break up the pasuk. The pasuk says in the parsha of Korban Pesach in Bo, it says V'chi yagur itcha ger v'yasa Pesach Hashem. Period. That's where you'd stop. And then it says Himolo Kol Zachar. But according to Rav Chizda, Rabbi Yehuda reads it flowing as if it said Lashem Himol. And we're going to soon see that indeed the Chachamim are not willing to accept that way that Rabbi Yehuda breaks down the pasuk and takes the word Lashem, which is referring to Pesach Lashem, which means that the Korban Pesach needs Lishma, and then attach it to Himolo. But that's Rabbi Yehuda's unique shita. For Rabbi Yossi says that the pasuk in Lech Lecha has a redundancy because it says Himol Yimol Yilid Beischa. Why the double language Himol Yimol? That's always a ribui, and that's coming to be marbe a circumcision without any lishma that was not done for the sake of the mitzvah, and it's still valid. The idach, meaning Rabbi Yossi haksiv lashem himol, and the answer is pashat ahut bepesach ksiv. You don't read it lashem himol, but rather you read it v'asa pesach lashem. Stop, and then himol lo kol zachar. V'idach nami, but Rabbi Yehuda, what is he going to do with the extra pasuk himol timol, which we were marbe, even if it was mila shalom lishma? And the answer is zibra Torah kol shebei, meaning that Rabbi Yehuda is not impressed by the double language. Very often the Torah uses the double language for emphasis, just like in the way we speak in colloquial language, we also double up language. Itmar minayin lemila b'ovid kocham shipsula. What is the source from which we derive? Now, we already have an answer to this question in our back pocket because the Gemara previously had mentioned that Rabbi Yehuda holds the ata es brisi fishmar. So we're going to have a little bit of a repetition here. Daru, one of the 10 sons of Rav Papa, Bar Papa, Mishmei de Rav Omar, the ata es brisi tishmar. And it's got to be the ata, it's got to be you who are subject to the bris. You could do the milah. Rabbi Yochanan Amar himol yimol, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, we have a different source for the halacha that an idol worship is excluded from milah, and his milah is invalid because himol yimol. Now, how does himol yimol, which we thought in Rabbi Yossi earlier was a ribui, how is it going to serve now in Rabbi Yochanan's favorite reference as a miut to exclude the milah of an oved kol chavin? So apparently, what Rabbi Yochanan is learning is that you don't read it with the vowels of himol yimol, but rather himol hamul. Hamul yimol. Hamul means someone who's included in milah can do the milah. Now we're going to have to see is what about a woman? Can a woman be kosher for milah? Because according to Rabbi Yochanan L'chorah, she's not himol because she's not subject to milah. Therefore, she cannot perform milah. However, we have another issue. If according to Rabbi Yochanan, himol, only someone who is gemalt or is subject and included in milah, yimol, he could do the milah. What about a guy who's mahul? Right, so some of the goyim apparently followed milah. So Gemara says, "My beinayu arvi mahul v'gavnuni mahul ika beinayu." Now we're going to see here a havamina, and then the Gemara is going to reject it. In the havamina, the Gemara understands that if an Arvi was Mohul, then that validates him as Hamol. Right? So therefore, Hamol Yimol, he could be Mal someone else. Whereas according to Rabbi Yehuda, who derives it from, as Daru Bar Papa said in the name of Rav, from the Pasuk as Brisi Atos Brisi Tishmar, obviously the fact that the Aravi underwent milah is irrelevant. He's still not included in as Brisi Tishmar, and therefore he's invalid. So the Gemara analyzes it now. The Gemara says the following: Mandi Omer Himol Yimol, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that you need someone who is gemalt, and then he could be mal ika. So in this case of the Arab who did milah, he can be kosher for milah. The Gemara is going to reject this immediately. Umandi Omer es Brisi Tishmar leka. You can't say the Aravi is included as Brisi Tishmar. It's a special bris between Klal Yisrael and the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Gemara rejects. L'man Yomer Himol Yimol Ika. You saying that now the Aravi, according to Rabbi Yochanan, under Himol, since he's already Gemalt, he can be Mal? That's impossible. Because this now we have a mission in the Dorim. Konam Shani Nenem in Arelim. If a person takes a konam, which means a neder, that he enjoins himself from having any benefit from an RL. So now you have two questions. Could he benefit from a Jew who is not Gemalt because he's an RL? And number two, would we permit him to benefit from a guy who had Mila because he already has no Orla? And the Gemara rejects both. Actually, it's a Mishnah. Muta bi'arle Yisrael, though it's even a Jew who's an RL, is still included under someone who has Mila because he's subject to Mila, and therefore when the person took a neder prohibiting upon himself an RL, he did not include a Jew. But also b'mulei ofikachom, in the exact opposite case of a guy who underwent Mila, he's still considered an RL. So the fact that he went through this operation and circumcision is irrelevant because a guy is a guy is a guy, and he doesn't get the status of a mohul, and therefore if he's still called an RL, and therefore you take a neder enjoining yourself from benefit from an RL, you're not allowed to benefit from a guy who had Mila. So anyway, the Maisa, we see that an Aravi who is Mol is still considered an RL. So how then can you set this up as an Afkamina and say that according to Rabbi Yochanan, Hamol Yimol, and include under Hamol an Aravi Mol and say that he's kosher for meal? That's not so. He's still an RL. Ella, the Gemara says, now we have to find another substitute of an Afkamina here between Dari Bar Papa, the name of Rav, and Rabbi Yochanan, Ika Beinayu Yisrael Shemesu Echav Machmas Mila V'Lamalo. The halacha is that if Nebuchadnezzar's child is born number 3, he's the third boy in the family, and the first 2 boys died from Mila, it's what we call in English, I think, hemophilia, if I'm not mistaken, a blood disease that you can't clot the blood. So we don't do Mila to the third son. Maybe the first was a fluke, a tragic accident. But once it happens twice, we're already assuming that there's something in the genes here, a genetic problem, and therefore we don't do Mila to the third. Now, what's the status of this third son? He, on the one hand, is an RL in the physical sense, because he didn't undergo Mila. But on the other hand, he's included under Mila. So therefore, Lamandi Amaratos Bisi Tishmar Ika, he could fulfill the mitzvah. He could implement the circumcision because he's included under Viatos Bisi Tishmar. But Lamandi Yomer, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says Himol Yimol, that you need to say that he's already Gemalt, Leka, he's not Gemalt. The Gemara is going to reject this as well. Lamandi Yomer Himol Yimol Leka? Are you telling me that if you hold Himol Yimol, this guy's an RL because his 2 brothers died and we're not going to mal him, and therefore his Milo is not kosher? For Tanan, we learned in the same Mishnah in Nedarim that we quoted earlier, Konam Shani Nenem Mulim, person takes a neder enjoining himself from Mulim. And now you could ask me, what about the case of Mesu Bachum? Is he included in the neder or not? Asur ba'arola Yisrael, umuter b'mulei ovei kol chavit. So it means that only an RL is considered, right? Konam shani nene mimulim, right? That I derive pleasure from someone who's circumcised. If I derive pleasure from someone who's circumcised, then I'm also bekonam, meaning I'm not allowed to benefit from someone who's circumcised. And it says asur bi'arole Yisrael mutar b'mulei ovikol chamalma. We see from this the afagavdalo mehile, Kimad mehili dami. In other words, the language of Harola Yisrael is referring to an Orel who violated, so to speak, the mitzvah of Mila, and he did not fulfill his chiyuv. But if he wasn't included in the chiyuv at all, he's not an Orel. So the Orlus, as a halachic entity, is generated by the chiyuv Mila. But when there's no chiyuv Mila, there's no Orlus. So it's not a physical thing. So even though he has the foreskin, never mind, he's still considered mole. And therefore, we come to the conclusion that even though, according to Rabbi Yochanan, we derive the psul of Akum Shemol from Himol because he's an Orel, that would not exclude and invalidate the Milah of Mesu Ochid Machsab Milah because he is considered a Mol. So we now have to come up with another nafkamina, Ikabenayu, not Isha. Lamandi Aviata as BC Tishma, obviously she's included as BC Tishmar, Leka. Gemara says Leka, just one second. The Isha is not included in the mitzvah of Mila, and therefore she cannot perform Mila. She's not included Viatos BC Tishmar. Ulamandi Omer Himol Yimol. Ika, the Isha commanded Mehila Dami. What pressed the Gemara to this conclusion? Because we said that Orlus is a result of the non-fulfillment of the Chiyuv Mila, but she doesn't have a Chiyuv Mila, therefore she doesn't have Orlus, and therefore she's considered as if she was Gemalt, and she's included under Himol, but she doesn't have the bris of Mila itself, and therefore she's excluded. The Gemara rejects this as well. There's no one who would disqualify a woman from doing the circumcision because Tzipora was the one who implemented the circumcision. She took a sharp stone and she did Mila on her sons. So we see that a woman is included in creating a valid Mila, which would mean that she's included under Atos BC Tishma. So Gemara says no. A woman cannot do Mila according to Rabbi Yochanan. She's not included, according to Dori Bar Papa, she's not included in SBC Tishma. Why? What do we do with Tzipora? Karibe Vatakach. Don't read it Vatikach Tzipora Tsar. Change the vowelization and read it as Vatakach. Vatakach means that she sent a shliach, a man, to do the Mila. So the word vatakach means she appointed someone, vatakach. The pasuk says that she cut off the foreskin. Kari Bey, you have to reread it, change the vowelization. Vatachres. Vatachres means she told someone else to cut the foreskin. So if we stop here, we come to the conclusion that according to Rabbi Yochanan, I always get to, according to Dari Bar Papa, the Mila of a woman is invalid. She's not included in the Ata SBC Tishman. The case of Tzipora is that she appointed a man to implement the Mila. However, now the Gemara gives an alternative answer. Ibais Ema Asya Ihi vi Aschala vi Asa Moshe vi Agmar. So basically, the voice Ema is fundamentally in the same court, if I could use that term, as what we saw until now, meaning that a woman is not included on the Viata SBC Tishmar. You'll ask me, so how did Tzipor do the Mila? The answer is she only started the Mila, but the Mila was concluded by Moshe Rabbeinu. He was mashlim the Mila. And this leads us to the main subject of today's daf, Misrapim Mehem Ripui Mama. Now we're talking about allowing an idolater to perform surgery or alternatively, any sort of medical treatment. And as we discussed many times, the idolaters were enemies of the Jewish people and they wanted to kill the Jews. But the Mishnah sets up a distinction, which the Gemara is going to try to analyze, between ripui mammon and ripui nefesh. So if it's ripui mammon, which let's say, as opposed to ripui nefesh, means that the patient is not in life state in danger of losing his life. So then we could allow an idolater to to implement medical procedures. But ripui nefashos, no. Meaning, if your victim, again, we'll see various interpretations of this, Mishnah, I'm offering one, that if the victim is in a life-threatening situation, then we cannot allow an idolater to perform medical treatment because he's going to kill the patient, and he doesn't have to worry about his reputation because he's going to say the guy was going to die anyway. Whereas in the case of ripui mammon, which is not a life-threatening situation, then the reputation of the Rofe is on the line here, because if he kills the patient was not in a life-threatening situation, then obviously he's a killer. Now, what about taking haircuts? Ein misrapim em b'chol makom di Reb Meir. Reb Meir says that we can't take haircuts from them. They have the knife, and who knows what they'll do with the knife. Chachamim omrim b'shesarab mutav lo beino u'leveino. In private, you better not allow an idolater to cut your hair. He might cut your throat. But if it's public and his reputation is at stake, then he'll be very careful and he won't kill you. Okay. Now the Gemara wants to know, my ripui mammon or my ripui nefashos? Why do you tell me that you're allowed to use a guy, an idol worshiper, for performing medical treatment in a case of mammon, but not in the case of nefashos? If you'll interpret this all ahavavi, Shemar is going to reject that. Ripui mammon means we're paying him wages, but ripui nefashos bechinam, and the word nefashos here really means just that we're not paying him; he's just volunteering his services. Is lisnei, then we have a classic language in the Mishnah all over the show to differentiate between these two categories. It should have said misrapim mehem b'schar, avolo misrapim mehem bechinam. In other words, you can hire them and pay them wages as a physician and let them perform medical treatment, but not gratuitously. Ella, therefore, we have to come up with another explanation of the distinction between ripui mammon and ripui nefashos. Ripui mammon davar she'ein bo sakana. That's how we interpret it in the Mishnah. There's no life-threatening situation. And ripui nefashos davar she'ein bo sakana, the man who needs desperately medical treatment is in danger of losing his life. So now we have to figure out what's the logic over here. So that's what we suggested earlier. Let's just see if we can reiterate it and analyze it, that in the case of ripui nefashos, we have to be very afraid of the fact that the Rofe will deliberately kill the patient here. This idol worshiper will kill the patient, and he'll explain it away by saying the guy was going to die anyway. But in the case of ripui mammon she'ein bo sakanas nefashos, there the guy is not going to fiddle around and try to kill the Jew because his reputation is at stake. So the Gemara says, "Va'amar Rav Yehuda afilu rivda de kusilta lo mitasinon minayu." Now, the word mitasinon is an Aramaic word for refuah in Hebrew, which means to treat him medically. And what's rivda de kusila? So elsewhere we have kusila as a bloodletter. Rivda is the sorry, not the pipe. I don't know what word you want to call it. The injection or the needle that you put in order to take out the blood, to draw blood, like if you take a blood test. And Rav says that even in the case of a bloodletter, you're not allowed to be treated by an idolater bloodletter. Now, bloodletting is for purpose of lowering blood pressure, but it's not a life-threatening situation. And yet, Rav says we're not allowed to use the services of an idolater bloodletter. So don't tell me that when the Mishnah says Ripui Mammon is mutter, and you could avail yourself of the services of an idolater, it's because it's Einbo Pikuach Einbo Sakana. That's not so, because Rav says even a bloodletter you can't take of it. That's not a Sakana situation. Ella, so we have to come up with another distinction. Ripui Mammon Behemto. I was going to reject this as well. Ripui Nefashis Kufe. If you're hiring a veterinarian, so you know what? Hire the guy. And if in the worst tragic situation he kills the animal, okay, you lost an animal. But if he's treating the body of a person, of a human being, of a Jew, then we can't allow ourselves in any circumstance to avail ourselves of the medical treatment of an idolater. He might kill you. Therefore, we understand that even in the case of a situation that's not life-threatening like bloodletting, nevertheless, we can't use and avail ourselves of the service of an idolater. Today, you go online and you could ask for suggestions for treatments. And they're very sophisticated sites online that you have to pay for, to get a diagnosis and a prescription and so forth and so on. Not a prescription. What's the word? Help me out here, Steve.
Diagnosis?
A what?
Diagnosis?
No, what's the stage after diagnosis when he prescribes something?
Just treatment?
No, yeah, it's part of treatment, but there's a specific word when he tells you take, the following antibiotics. Okay. Anyway, there's a word in English for that. And we're allowed to go to an idol worshiper and ask him to tell us what treatment, to suggest an antibiotic or any other sort of drug that we could take. And we follow his recommendation.